What would you do if you said I do, and only found out afterward that you married the wrong man? Lottie McAdams had rehearsed the vows. The dress fit. The papers were signed. But when she turned to meet her new husband, it wasn't the man she'd been promised. It was Graham Whitmore, billionaire heir, cold strategist, and completely unaware of the deception that brought her to his side. 2 lives, 2 lies. 1 marriage neither of them consented to, but both are now trapped inside. She could run. He could annul. But legacy, money, and reputation demand they pretend as if the altar hadn't already betrayed them. Now put yourself in her shoes. Would you stay with the man who wasn't meant to be yours, but might understand you more deeply than anyone else ever could? This isn't a story about fate. It's about control, about identity, about what happens when 2 strangers are forced to trust not by love, but by necessity. If you've ever wondered what lies beneath carefully curated lives and how far someone would go to reclaim their name, like this video, share it with someone who's ever had to choose between duty and desire, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Now, let's begin. The cathedral was silent. Not just quiet, but reverently, almost oppressively silent, the way a room becomes when everyone is holding their breath. The soft hum of the pipe organ had faded, and all eyes turned toward the man standing alone at the altar. He didn't move, not a twitch, not a blink. Just the stiff posture of a man whose reality had collapsed in a single moment. Graham Whitmore, age 40, billionaire heir to the Whitmore financial empire, stood in front of his bride and stared at her as if she were a stranger, because she was. She was covered from head to toe in white lace, a heavy veil obscuring her face. But even through the fabric, he could tell this wasn't the woman in the photographs. This wasn't the polished, graceful figure he'd been shown over champagne at corporate dinners. This wasn't the smiling, soft-spoken daughter of Ruth McAdams he had agreed to marry, however reluctantly. No, this woman had a different posture. Shoulders back, chin slightly tilted downward, hands wrapped tightly around a bouquet of peonies and hydrangeas so tightly that her knuckles were pale. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't lifted the veil. And neither had he. The guests had arrived in silence and were now trapped in it. Executives, politicians, media moguls, all seated in orderly rows inside the historic St. Cecilia's Cathedral, waiting to witness a merger disguised as matrimony. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a corporate alignment valued at over $18 billion. But no one had told Graham that the bride under the veil wasn't the same one he'd been promised. A low murmur rose from somewhere in the back. The priest cleared his throat. Graham's mind raced. He'd been raised for this every inch of his life, carved to serve the Whitmore dynasty. The schools, the speeches, the engagements that never led to marriage because his father disapproved. He had been told that this was the right move. Charlotte McAdams is the ideal partner, intelligent enough to hold her own, refined enough to be your wife, his father had said, sipping scotch like he was sealing a deal, not marrying off his son. But the woman in front of him wasn't the woman in those photos. He took a step forward, as if to say something, but his voice caught in his throat. He felt 1,000 eyes watching. And then, a whisper. "I'm sorry." He blinked. The voice had come from the woman, soft, low, unmistakably real. For a moment, he thought he imagined it. "I had no choice," she added, barely louder than a breath. He looked up, right into the veil. He couldn't see her eyes. But something in her voice, steady, yet deeply sorrowful, pierced through the layers of expectation and pride that had wrapped around his life like a noose. Behind him, someone signaled for the organist to play again. Music swelled, artificial and grand. The priest gestured for them to move forward. Graham stood rooted, watching his father's face in the front pew. Harold Whitmore nodded once, his expression tight and commanding. "Do it." The priest began. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." Graham didn't hear the rest. His bride did not move, and still he did not lift the veil. Not yet. Because beneath the silk and lace, he sensed something else. Something that didn't belong in a room full of power plays and legal contracts. Something broken. Or maybe brave. Whatever it was, it scared him more than anything he had ever faced. And he'd faced Wall Street. Graham had never been the kind of man to hesitate. In boardrooms, he was decisive. In court filings, precise. In crisis, calm. But here, at the altar, he stood as if frozen in place, not by fear, but by a creeping sense of betrayal that spread slowly, like ink in water. The priest's voice was still speaking ancient vows, echoing off the cathedral's marble columns, to have and to hold, from this day forward. The veil shimmered in the golden afternoon light, delicate and layered, hiding the features of the woman who had just whispered. "I'm sorry." He could feel his heartbeat now too loud, too sharp. He reached out, slowly, deliberately. His hands brushed the edges of the veil. The fabric was heavier than it looked. He hesitated, then he lifted it. The moment felt impossibly long, a breath held by everyone in the room, suspended in ceremony and discomfort. When her face was finally revealed, Graham felt everything and nothing at once. She had dark blonde hair, swept back into a loose bun, with wisps that framed her face naturally, not artificially styled. Her skin was pale, lightly freckled, and her features were striking, but not in the airbrushed, magazine cover way he had been led to expect. Her nose slightly curved, her chin subtle but firm. Her lips were pressed together in something between resolve and regret. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Not because they were the wrong color, though they were. The woman in the photo had icy blue eyes. The woman before him had storm gray ones, deeper and sadder than he had imagined anyone that young could carry. They were the eyes of someone who had lived through something and didn't talk about it. "I'm not who you thought I was," she said softly, steady now. "My name is Charlotte, but people call me Lottie." She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize again. Graham looked over at his father. Harold Whitmore sat unmoved, stone-faced. No surprise, no concern, only approval that the veil was now off and the ceremony could move forward. Beside him, Ruth McAdams looked the other way, pretending to adjust her gloves. So they knew. They knew all along. The air in the cathedral felt colder now. Graham turned back to Lottie. Why, he asked. The word was barely audible, more shape than sound. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw not just a stranger, but a woman standing on the edge of something much larger than herself. "Because I wasn't given a choice," she said, "and I figured neither were you." The organ music shifted, bright, triumphant. The priest nodded toward Graham, waiting for him to continue with the vows. He didn't speak. Not yet. He looked back at the guests. Most of them weren't even watching. They were texting, whispering, smiling politely for photographs that would soon flood the business pages. He was supposed to say yes. Just nod, get through the ceremony, finish the merger. He knew that. But for the first time, he couldn't do what was expected. Because something fundamental had cracked open inside him, and he wasn't sure it could be closed again. 2 weeks earlier, Graham had been handed a file. It wasn't the kind of folder an assistant normally delivers. It was leather-bound, embossed with gold initials, and sealed shut with a ribbon. Inside, a curated biography, high-gloss photographs, financial summaries, philanthropic blurbs, the kind of document used to sell an investment or a person. The subject was Charlotte McAdams, 29, daughter of Ruth McAdams, CEO of McAdams Telecom, a company teetering on the edge of a hostile takeover. Graham read through it like any other proposal, at least until his father closed the office door and said, "She'll be your wife by the end of the month." Graham had looked up, eyebrows raised, but face unreadable. "I didn't realize I was being auctioned off." Harold Whitmore had chuckled. You're being positioned. It's a strategic alliance. We merge with McAdams Telecom now. We dominate the infrastructure pipeline for the next decade. You don't need to fall in love, you just need to say, "I do." Graham had stood, walked to the window, and watched Manhattan pulsing below him. It was the city that had raised him like a stern father, demanding, unforgiving, obsessed with appearances. He knew how these deals worked, but this wasn't a deal. This was a life. And what happens when she realizes she's married to a ghost? Graham had asked. "You've molded me into a CEO, not a husband." Harold poured himself a drink. "You've had plenty of chances to be both. You turned them all down. This is just business. Clean, efficient. clean and efficient. That was how his father saw everything from mergers to marriages to mistakes. And now, 2 weeks later, Graham was standing at an altar beside a woman he didn't know, whose photo in the file had not matched the real person, because even the lie had been curated. Lottie stood quietly next to him, hands still firm around her bouquet, her eyes no longer afraid, just resolute. There was dignity in that stillness, and Graham felt the weight of it more than he wanted to admit. The ceremony moved on, mechanical and hollow. Vows were spoken, rings exchanged, lips pressed politely to cheeks. Guests applauded with just enough enthusiasm to appear genuine. And just like that, the merger was sealed. At the reception, held in the grand ballroom of Whitmore Manor, nothing felt real, not the clinking of glasses, not the strings of violin music, not even the congratulatory nods from titans of industry. Graham moved through the crowd like a well-dressed puppet, Lottie at his side, their arms linked in the choreography of high society. But inside, he was unraveling. He'd agreed to marry for the company. He hadn't agreed to be lied to. And more than that, he hadn't agreed to lie to himself. They retreated to the private suite on the 3rd floor of the estate by midnight. No one followed. No one cared what happened next. The contract had been fulfilled. The cameras were off. Graham loosened his tie. Lottie stood at the window, still in her dress, her back to him. "Did you know," he asked quietly. She turned. "That you were shown someone else's photo?" "No, I found out only days ago. Why didn't you say anything?" She looked away. Would it have changed anything? He didn't answer, because it wouldn't have, and somehow, that made it worse. The morning after the wedding came softly. Outside, the trees at Whitmore Manor rustled under a late autumn breeze. The sky was gray but gentle, the kind of weather that made people linger in bed a little longer if they had someone to linger with. Graham was already awake. He had spent most of the night on the couch, fully dressed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. He hadn't spoken another word after their brief exchange the night before. He couldn't. Words felt flimsy compared to the weight of what had just happened. A marriage. To a stranger. And not just any stranger, but one wrapped in deception, curated by people who claimed to love them. From the suite's kitchenette, he could smell coffee, real coffee, not the bland hotel kind. Someone was brewing it fresh. He sat up, adjusted his collar, and walked toward the sound. In the kitchen stood Lottie, still in her wedding dress, though the veil was gone. Her hair was let down, cascading over one shoulder in soft waves. Her makeup had faded. She looked tired and real. She turned when she heard him. "I couldn't sleep," she said, holding out a second mug without asking. He took it. Their fingers brushed. They drank in silence for a while. "I was supposed to be married once before," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the window above the sink. "Years ago. It ended before it started. He told me I wasn't marketable enough." Graham didn't reply. "Ruth, my mother, made sure that never happened again. She said I had one shot left, and this time, it had to count." Her voice was calm, but the stillness in it was heavy. Graham leaned against the counter. "You let them use you like a pawn." Lottie raised an eyebrow. "Didn't you?" He looked at her, and there it was. Not defiance, not guilt, just honesty. He set the mug down. The woman in the file, the blonde with blue eyes. Who was she? Lottie shrugged. A model. Probably. PR team said it would photograph better. You weren't supposed to know until the reception, but I guess someone decided to hold the illusion until the very last second. "I don't like being lied to," Graham said. Lottie met his gaze. "Neither do I." There was a long pause. "You speak differently than I expected," he said. "And how did you expect me to speak?" He hesitated, polished, empty, rehearsed. She smiled faintly. "I'm not good at pretending. My mother hates that. I've noticed she prefers presentation." Lottie leaned on the edge of the sink. "My father died when I was 14. After that, Ruth stopped believing in softness. She ran the company like a warship. And I became a soldier." Graham watched her. No bitterness, no self-pity, just facts. He found himself speaking before he could stop. I wanted to be an architect. She turned to him, surprised. When I was younger, I loved sketching buildings, spaces that made people feel something, not just structures, but sanctuaries. And what happened? My father, he said simply. She nodded. They understood each other in that moment more than either had expected. A silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that followed truth, the kind that left room for breathing. I don't want to be your enemy, Graham, she said finally. He looked at her. Then what are we? She hesitated, then shrugged, almost with a soft laugh. Roommates. He almost smiled. Roommates it is, he said, lifting his mug. For now, for two people bound by a wedding contract, Graham and Lottie lived like carefully scripted strangers. They occupied opposite ends of Whitmore Manor, a sprawling estate that had more rooms than either of them could count, and fewer warm corners than either of them had expected. The main suite was divided his and hers closets, a massive shared bathroom, two separate sleeping spaces. That suited them fine. For now, Graham spent most mornings in his home office on the second floor, reviewing numbers, speaking with board members, fielding calls from Whitmore Capital. He moved like a machine, efficient, organized, untouchable. Lottie, on the other hand, stayed quiet. She rose early, but not for corporate strategy. Instead, she moved through the house in soft slippers, hair tied back, mug in hand. She began tending the long neglected solarium on the east wing watering plants, clearing dust, opening windows to let in sunlight no one had noticed in years. She cooked, too, not every day, but often enough that the kitchen, once a showpiece for catered parties, began to smell like lemon zest and slow-baked bread. Graham noticed. Of course he did, but he didn't say anything. Until one evening, 4 days into their strange new life, he found himself standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her stir something on the stove. I didn't know we had real pots, he said dryly. Lottie glanced over her shoulder, unfazed. They were still in boxes. Most of them had never been used. He stepped inside. You cook often when I'm stressed. Are you stressed? She smiled without humor. We're in a marriage built on deception and corporate greed. Of course I'm stressed. He couldn't argue with that. She slid a bowl toward him. Butternut squash soup. Try it. He hesitated, then took the spoon. One taste surprised him. It was rich, savory, just the right hint of spice. This is good, he admitted. I cook, I garden, I code, she added casually. Triple threat, code. He raised an eyebrow. I was a software engineer before my mother pulled me back into the family business. MIT, dual major, computer science and behavioral economics. He blinked. That hadn't been in the file. She said it was more marketable to present me as refined and agreeable, not someone who spends 12 hours a day with algorithms. Your mother rebranded you. She rebranded everything she could, Lottie said, wiping her hands on a towel. But she forgot one thing. What's that? I still remember who I was before the branding. There was something in her voice, a quiet resistance that didn't demand attention, but refused to be ignored. Graham leaned against the counter, watching her move through the kitchen. She didn't carry herself like a trophy wife. She didn't speak like someone desperate for approval. She was composed, calm, and stubbornly real, the kind of person he didn't know how to categorize. Later that night, they passed each other in the hallway. She was carrying a book, Jane Austen, and a cup of chamomile tea. He nodded. She nodded back. No words. Just two people occupying the same space. Roommates, she had said, but something was changing. Because in the silence between them, there was no longer discomfort, only possibility. It started with a name misspelled on a quarterly report. Graham wasn't the kind of man to overlook small details. He built his reputation in the financial world on precision, the kind that either saved empires or destroyed them. So when the McAdams Telecom report listed a subcontractor as Northwest Integration Systems instead of their official registry name, Northwest Integrated Solutions, he flagged it immediately. At first, it seemed like a clerical error. Then he noticed it again and again. Same vendor, slightly altered name, inflated charges, backdated invoices. Something wasn't right. He leaned back in his office chair, eyes narrowing as the numbers rearranged themselves in his mind like puzzle pieces. Over $7 million funneled through this so-called vendor in just under 6 months. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a shadow account. Someone was bleeding money out of the McAdams firm and doing it well enough to avoid detection. Until now. Graham opened his encrypted files and began tracing the paper trail. Names, dates, account numbers. He didn't want to believe what the data was telling him. But numbers don't lie. People do. That night, the manor was unusually quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to hush itself. Lottie was curled on the living room sofa, surrounded by old business books, a half-empty glass of wine on the table beside her. The fireplace glowed softly, casting a warm shimmer across the space. Graham stood in the doorway, file in hand. "I need to ask you something," he said. She looked up. "Okay. Did you ever authorize payments to a firm called Northwest Integration Systems?" She frowned. "No." "Why?" "Because someone did, and they've been siphoning money from McAdams Telecom for months." He watched her closely. Lottie's face tightened, not with guilt, but with something sharper. Recognition. She stood up, crossing the room. "You found it too." "What do you mean?" "Two, I tried to confront my mother about it a few months ago. I found inconsistencies in Q2 billing. When I asked, she told me to stay in my lane. She said the finance team had everything under control." Graham's voice dropped. "She knew." Lottie nodded. "She always knows." "The question is why cover it up?" They stood in silence, the crackle of fire the only sound between them. Finally, Lottie spoke again. "Lottie, I think she was buying influence. Fast, quietly, to stay afloat. Or maybe to gain control after the merger." Graham tightened his grip on the folder. "She was planning to use me," he said. "Marry me to consolidate, then cut Whitmore out through backdoor deals." Lottie didn't argue. "I didn't know," she said quietly, "about the extent of it. I suspected, but I didn't want to believe she'd go that far, and yet." He replied, "Here we are." She sat back down, shoulders suddenly heavy. "My father built McAdams from scratch," she murmured. "After he died, my mother treated the company like a legacy, not a business, like it was hers to protect at any cost, including you." Lottie looked up. "And you think your father wouldn't do the same?" Graham didn't answer, because she was right. Harold Whitmore would sell anything anyone for control, even his son. Later that night, Graham stood by the window, watching the manor disappear into shadow. Behind him, Lottie approached with a file of her own. "I found this in the archives," she said, offering it without ceremony. "What is it?" "A board memo from 5 years ago. My mother tried to block a security audit. The vote was tied. Her vote carried it. That's when the siphoning began." He took it, eyes scanning the pages. She didn't wait for thanks. Instead, she said something else. "You know, for two people who were never meant to trust each other, we're doing a hell of a job starting to..." He looked up, and for the first time, didn't feel entirely alone. The invitation came in the form of a command. Harold Whitmore summoned his son to dinner. No excuses, no delays. It was to be held in the main dining hall of Whitmore Manor, complete with catered elegance and media-friendly floral arrangements, a photo opportunity masked as a family gathering. Lottie wasn't supposed to be there, but she came anyway. When she appeared at Graham's study before the dinner, he looked up, startled. "You don't have to go," he said. "I know," she replied, smoothing the skirt of her charcoal gray dress. "That's exactly why I will." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and they walked in together shoulder to shoulder for the first time. The dining hall smelled of citrus and control, crystal glasses, gold-rimmed plates. The table stretched longer than a bowling lane. Harold sat at the head, Ruth McAdams to his left, her lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. Graham and Lottie took their seats across from each other at the midpoint, not quite equals, not quite pawns. The first few minutes were stiff, filled with shallow pleasantries and clinking silver, the kind of conversation that was meant for headlines, not hearts. Then Harold set down his fork and looked at Graham. "I trust you've begun acclimating to married life," he said, voice casual but calculating. Graham didn't answer right away. He took a sip of water, set the glass down. "It's been enlightening." Ruth leaned in. "Charlotte's always been adaptable. That's one of her strengths." Lottie said nothing. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, but Graham could see the tension in her knuckles. Harold turned to Ruth. "Once the full integration is complete, we'll need your team to prepare for restructuring. Our board expects results." Graham's eyes sharpened. What kind of restructuring? Harold offered a diplomatic smile. "Standard consolidation, eliminate redundancies, refocus priorities." "You mean gut the McAdams team and replace them with your own," Graham said, voice steady. Harold's gaze flicked toward his son, cold, surprised, then dismissive. "You always had a soft spot for sentiment. Business isn't about loyalty, Graham. It's about leverage and integrity," Lottie asked softly, looking straight at him. "Where does that fit in?" Ruth's voice snapped through the air like a whip. "Integrity is a luxury, one we lost when McAdams nearly collapsed." Lottie blinked, stunned but not broken. It didn't collapse. It was dismantled internally. Quietly. "You know it. You're out of your depth." "Charlotte," Ruth said, her voice razor sharp, "you're here to secure your future, not relive your father's mistakes." Silence dropped like a curtain. Graham stood, slowly, calmly, but unmistakably. He looked at his father, then at Ruth, and then at Lottie. "My father used to tell me that control is power, that emotion is a liability, that people are tools to be moved across a board," he said. "But the truth is, your empire is cracking, not because of emotion, but because you've forgotten the people holding it up." Harold's expression turned steel. "Sit down." "Graham." "No," he said simply. He walked around the table, extended a hand to Lottie. "Come on," he said to her. She hesitated, then stood. Together. They walked out past silver platters, past cold eyes, past legacy and manipulation. Outside, the sky had opened up. Rain poured hard, soaking them within seconds. Lottie started to run, laughing through her breath, wet hair clinging to her shoulders. Graham followed, heart pounding not from anger, but from something wild and unfamiliar, freedom. They reached the edge of the garden pavilion, breathless. She turned to him, eyes glinting under the stormlight. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's exactly why I did." She smiled, and for the first time since the wedding, so did he. They didn't speak on the way back. The rain had soaked through their clothes, but neither of them seemed to mind. It was almost cleansing. Graham drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting against the cool leather. Lottie sat beside him, arms folded across her chest, eyes fixed on the blurred lights outside the window. They didn't need words. Not yet. Later that evening. Graham stood in front of the mirror in his private dressing room, a towel around his shoulders, steam still curling in the air from a hot shower. His reflection stared back, older than it had looked a week ago. Tired. Yes, but something else too, less certain. He thought about the dinner, the fury in his father's voice, the disappointment that had cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He thought about the way Lottie had stood up to Ruth, her voice calm, but her eyes burning. And then he thought about the feeling that had pulsed through his chest when she smiled in the rain. It scared him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it wasn't supposed to happen. This was never meant to be real. Across the manor, Lottie sat on the floor of her bedroom, a blanket around her shoulders, her old laptop open in front of her. The cursor blinked on a half-written email addressed to no one in particular. She'd started it dozens of times over the past few days. "I didn't come here to fall for him. Delete. I know this isn't love, but it feels dangerously close. Delete." She sighed, closing the laptop. This was never about love. It was about survival, about staying upright in a world where expectations outweighed identity. And yet, Graham had surprised her, not just tonight, in little ways. The way he always refilled the coffee without being asked, the way he never raised his voice, even when he was furious, the way he had looked at her that morning in the kitchen like he was seeing someone he'd never been allowed to see before. And maybe he was later. She found him on the back terrace, sitting in one of the old wooden chairs, a whiskey glass in hand. He didn't look up when she approached, but he didn't ask her to leave either. She sat beside him for a long time. They watched the rain fall onto the marble steps, the sound soft and steady. Finally, Graham spoke. When I was 17, he said, I told my father I wanted to go to architecture school. I'd been sketching buildings since I was a kid. I had a whole portfolio ready. He paused, swirled the whiskey. He looked at it for exactly 20 seconds. Then he said, You're not here to draw. You're here to build an empire. Lottie didn't speak. She just listened. That night, Graham continued, I tore up the drawings. All of them. I haven't sketched since. He looked at her now, eyes quieter than usual. Do you ever think about who you might have been, if no one had told you who to be? Lottie exhaled slowly, every single day. A hush settled between them, heavier than silence. We don't have to stay in this, he said, barely above a whisper. We can end it. Walk away. Say the merger failed. Lottie turned toward him. And then, what I don't know, Graham admitted, maybe we start over. Maybe we burn the whole thing down. She studied him, and maybe, she said, we stay. Not because they told us to, but because we decide what this becomes. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he felt the weight in his chest shift from resistance to resolve. She stood, offering her hand. Come inside. You'll catch a cold. He hesitated, then took her hand. The unseen battle wasn't over, but they were no longer fighting alone. They left before sunrise. No luggage, no bodyguards, no formal goodbyes. Just a quiet departure through the service entrance of Whitmore Manor, with the engine of Graham's vintage Land Rover humming low in the cold morning air. Lottie didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. He had told her. In that unspoken way, he was learning to trust that wherever they were headed, it wouldn't be anywhere their parents could find them. By late morning, they reached the edge of the Catskill Mountains, where the road narrowed into gravel and the sky opened into blue. Nestled between pine trees and tall grass, hidden beyond a gated fence, long overtaken by wild ivy, stood a modest cabin, a far cry from marble floors and glass walls. Graham parked and stepped out, looking at the place like it held more than just memories, like it had been waiting for him. I built it after grad school, he said, before everything got complicated. Lottie stood beside him, hugging her coat tighter. It's beautiful. It's unfinished. Like most worthwhile things, she replied. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and dust. Books lined the shelves, left untouched for years. A sketch pad lay open on the coffee table, yellowed with age. The fireplace hadn't been used in a long time, but the woodpile was full. Lottie set down the groceries they had picked up on the way. Graham lit the fire, and slowly, something softer began to unfold. That evening, they sat cross-legged on the floor, sharing pasta from the same pot, laughing at how terrible the sauce turned out. I think we missed salt, Lottie said. And flavor, Graham added. She leaned back on her elbows, eyes flickering in firelight. Still better than $1,000 plate at Whitmore banquets. He chuckled. Low bar. There was a beat of silence, but it didn't stretch awkwardly. It simply settled like the way snow rests quietly on pine. Lottie tilted her head. Do you ever come here? Just to breathe I used to, Graham said. Then breathing got expensive. She reached for the sketch pad, flipping through old drawings, angles of rooftops, cathedral ceilings, gardens that never existed. These are good, she murmured. I don't draw anymore. Why not? He hesitated, then looked at her. Because I forgot how to make anything that wasn't for someone else. Her eyes met his. Then maybe it's time you made something for yourself. Later. As night fell like a heavy blanket, They moved to the porch wrapped in blankets, mugs of tea warming their hands. Crickets sang softly. A fox darted across the clearing. The world, for once, was still. I used to dream of a place like this, Lottie said, quiet, honest, no expectations. Graham didn't answer right away. He reached into the sketch pad and tore out a page. Then, with the small pencil she handed him, he drew a window, a wide one, with trees just beyond. She leaned in. "What's that room?" he said. "For new things." She smiled. And then, for reasons neither of them needed to explain, she laid her head on his shoulder. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was closer than either had dared to hope. The morning mist wrapped around the cabin like an old friend. Graham rose before sunrise, stepping onto the porch with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders and a mug of black coffee in hand. Inside, he could hear the soft rustling of Lottie waking up, the creak of floorboards, the hush of slippers on wood. They had been there for 3 days now, and in that time, something had shifted, not loud or sudden, but slow, like ice melting under spring light. It was in the way Lottie hummed when she washed the dishes, in the way Graham had started sketching again rooftops, garden paths, her face in profile when she wasn't looking. It was peace, unfamiliar, unearned, but real. That morning, while organizing a stack of old folders tucked away behind a bookshelf, Lottie found a box. It was wooden, hand-carved, with a brass latch. Inside, time had curled the corners of documents and faded the ink of letters. But one name caught her eye, Eleanor Whitmore. She sat on the floor, thumbing through the pages, heart thudding with a mix of awe and disbelief. By the time Graham came in from chopping firewood, she had arranged the contents across the floor like a crime scene. "Did you know," she asked, "that your grandmother co-founded one of the first communication networks in the Midwest?" He blinked. "Eleanor, I thought she was just a housewife. That's all my father ever said." "She wasn't," Lottie replied, handing him a letter. "She partnered with Margaret Holloway McAdams, my great-grandmother." Graham stared at the page. Black ink, cursive handwriting, plans sketched on napkins and notepads, designs for radio towers, encrypted signals, something called the trust line. They worked together, he said, for 10 years, until the men in their lives forced them out and buried the work under shell corporations. A silence fell over them both. Then Graham spoke, his voice quiet. "So the companies our families built Whitmore Capital. McAdams Telecom weren't originally about power. They were about progress." "Exactly," Lottie said. "They built something new, and then it was taken from them. They sat with the truth like it was sacred, and then something even quieter passed between them, a decision." That night, they lit a fire and spread the documents across the table. Lottie took out her laptop. Graham unrolled new architectural sketches this time, not of mansions or office towers, but of collaborative workspaces, tech hubs, rural access centers. They dreamed aloud. "What if we rebuilt it?" Lottie said. "Not just the network, but the purpose behind it. A company grounded in equity." Graham added, "Real access, real voices, no boardroom backstabbing, no legacy games, just truth," he said. She nodded. "And us," she added. He looked at her, surprised, not because of what she said, but because he realized it was the first time she'd said us like it mattered. And it did. Later, under a sky full of stars, they sat outside, a blueprint between them and a future ahead. "We could call it Whitmore McAdams Innovations," Graham said. "Too long," Lottie teased. "Fine, WMI, for short." She smiled, then turned to him. "Let's build something that doesn't need to be hidden." He reached for her hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that belied the weight of what was about to happen. Graham adjusted the cuffs of his suit, the same one he wore the day he said vows he hadn't meant only now. He wore it like armor. Beside him, Lottie stood tall in a navy blue blazer, hair swept back, her face unreadable but resolute. They stepped into the 44th floor boardroom of Whitmore Capital. It was all glass and chrome and control. At the far end sat Harold Whitmore, already flipping through a legal binder. To his right, Ruth McAdams stared out the window, arms crossed, her reflection sharp in the glass. The rest of the board was present 10 men and women in tailored suits, eyes curious, lips tight, unsure of what today would bring. It would bring everything. Harold spoke first. "You're late." Graham didn't flinch. "We weren't invited. This is a board meeting." "No," Lottie said clearly, placing a black folder on the table. "This is a reckoning." She opened the folder, sliding documents across the polished surface: financial statements, shell company maps, leaked emails, and most damning of all, board memos signed by Ruth and Harold, authorizing secret restructuring and asset misallocation under the guise of merger alignment. Gasps and whispers rippled down the table. Harold's voice hardened. "You have no authority to—" "We do now," Graham interrupted. "As of this morning, we've secured a controlling interest through Eleanor's original shares, reclaimed per clause 14A of the founding agreement." Ruth turned, eyes flashing. "You're bluffing." "No," Lottie said softly. "We're restoring." A board member leaned forward. "This isn't just a power grab, it's the opposite," Graham replied. "It's a course correction. What started as innovation became inheritance. What should have been shared became shadowed. We're building something new. Whitmore McAdams Innovations WMI," Lottie added, "a company founded on transparency, inclusion, and legacy, earned not inherited." Another board member asked, "And you expect us to believe you're doing this for principle?" "No," Lottie said. "We expect you to believe the numbers and the truth behind them." She paused, then glanced at Graham. "And maybe, just maybe, believe that it's still possible to choose what's right." The room was silent. Then someone began to clap. It was Marla Sanders, one of the longest-serving board members, and one of the few who had known Eleanor personally. "I remember when this place had soul," she said. "I say let them try." Others murmured in agreement. Heads nodded. Harold stood abruptly. "You're burning down what took a lifetime to build." Graham turned to his father, quiet but firm. "No, you built walls. We're opening doors." Ruth faced Lottie, and when it fails, Lottie's voice didn't waver. "Then at least we'll know it was ours." Outside, the sky cracked with spring thunder. Inside, the vote was taken, and history shifted. That evening, Graham and Lottie stood at the top of the building, looking down over the city, not as captives, but as architects of something new. He turned to her. "You ready for this?" She smiled. "I've never been readier." The press conference was brief. No grand slogans, no victory speeches. Just two people standing behind a simple podium at the new headquarters of Whitmore McAdams Innovations, with the soft spring breeze drifting through the open windows. Graham adjusted the microphone. "My name is Graham Whitmore," he began. "And I used to believe that legacy was something we inherited. I was wrong. Legacy is something we build through choice, through change, and through the people we choose to build it with." Lottie stood beside him, calm and clear. "This company was founded on deception," she said, "not bitter, but honest. But what we're creating now, this next chapter, is built on restoration, not just of values, but of voices that were long forgotten. They didn't take questions. They didn't need to. The story was already rewriting itself." Weeks later, the cabin was once again filled with the scent of coffee and wildflowers. Lottie stood barefoot on the porch, sketchpad in hand, capturing the outline of a small greenhouse she and Graham were planning to build out back. Graham stepped outside, holding two mugs. Architect and engineer. He teased. She smiled. "Partners in crime." "No," he said gently, handing her the cup. "Partners, by choice." They sat together in the sun, no longer in hiding, no longer pretending, just two people who had learned that love, real love, doesn't arrive with fireworks or ultimatums. It grows, quietly, through the cracks. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. It was handwritten, in a looping, careful script. From Marla Sanders, now semi-retired. She had enclosed a photograph, black and white, frayed at the edges. It showed two women in lab coats, smiling, leaning over a workbench filled with radio parts. On the back, Eleanor and Margaret, June 1954, Queens, NY. Below that, Marla had written, "They dreamed of connecting the world. You made sure their voices weren't lost. Thank you for choosing to listen." That night, Graham and Lottie sat by the fire once more. She rested her head against his chest. He held her hand like a vow, not the kind spoken at an altar, but the kind lived out, quietly, in the choices we make each day. Neither of them said anything. They didn't have to, because this time, silence didn't mean absence. It meant presence. It meant peace. It meant home. Sometimes, love doesn't arrive in perfect form. Sometimes, it shows up in silence, behind a veil, carrying wounds that history tried to bury. Graham and Lottie didn't fall in love because the world told them to. They chose each other in spite of it, against the weight of legacy, against the machinery of power, and against a system that told them who they should be and who they shouldn't love. Their journey reminds us that real connection doesn't come from appearances, wealth, or expectations. It comes from listening, from daring to see the person beneath the image, from standing beside someone, not because you were told to, but because you believe in who they are. And maybe, just maybe, that's how we begin to heal the damage caused by judgment, control, and yes, discrimination. Because no matter how polished the world looks on the outside, what we choose with compassion, with courage, is what truly defines us. If this story moved you, even just a little, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that matter, stories that speak to the heart, challenge injustice, and remind us that we're never as alone as we think. Until the next story, stay kind, stay brave, and never stop choosing love.